Good afternoon and welcome. The Subcommittee on the Federal Workforce, U.S. Postal Service, and Census is hereby called to order. We're ready to get our hearing underway. I'd like to begin by reciting the mission statement of the Government Oversight and Reform Committee. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have the right to know that the money Washington takes for them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Government Oversight and Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold the government accountable to taxpayers because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We'll work tirelessly in partnership with citizens watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Government Oversight and Reform Committee. And I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. 9 months ago, the whole Committee of Government Oversight and Reform held a hearing on the now infamous GSA Las Vegas conference. It cost the taxpayers more than $750,000 spent by the agency that's charged with keeping federal costs low. Shortly following that boondoggle and justifiable public outcry accompanying it, the OMB issued a memo in May of 2012 outlining new policies and procedures for federal travel and conferences. The OMG guidance instructs the heads of federal departments and agencies for the fiscal year 2013 to spend at least 30% less on travel expenses than they did in fiscal year 2010. This is similar to a recommendation of the President's Simpson-Bowles Commission. If that goal is met, the federal government will have spent around $4.6 billion in non-military federal employee travel this year. In addition, the OMB memo offers new rules for conferences, such as requiring senior-level review for planned events, senior-level approval and public reporting for those in excess of $100,000, and a general prohibition on those costing more than $500,000 unless the head of an agency provides a waiver. For FY 2012 alone, there were over 750 conferences that cost in excess of $100,000. The total cost to the taxpayers of these events was more than $250 million. With the looming $85 billion across-the-board sequester spending cuts and the administration's unwillingness to offer specific cost-saving measures, today's hearing offers us an opportunity to hear how OMB's directive, if fully and responsibly implemented, can potentially help save the taxpayers billions of dollars by reducing travel and conference costs that may not be necessary for federal employees to discharge the duties of their office. We're hoping today to determine if these new policies have curbed wasteful expenditures and what new statutory changes may be required to reduce travel spending and appropriately shred greater transparency upon travel and conference spending. We want to ensure that a GSA Las Vegas type conference does not happen again. Last Congress, this committee approved legislation that eventually passed unanimously by the House of Representatives that would largely implement the guidelines of the OMB memo and create greater transparency of travel and conference spending. Our former colleague, Joanne Emerson, reintroduced this legislation, H.R. 313, the Government Spending and Accountability Act, earlier this year. This is not an indictment of conferences or travel. The district I represent, Corpus Christi, Texas, is a tourist destination home to many conferences. What this is an investigation into how the public money is spent. It's different than how the private sector money is spent. It's different how your personal money is spent. So there's always got to be kept in mind by those traveling on the taxpayers' dollars the need to be frugal, to treat that money better than they would treat their own money. I look forward now to hearing from the witnesses, and I will yield now to the ranking member, Mr. Lynch. I'm a Texan. Anybody north of Texas and Louisiana is potentially a Yankee.
There you go. Happy to do that. As a Red Sox fan, you got to go easy though. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, let me congratulate you on your appointment as Chairman of our subcommittee. From addressing comprehensive reform of the United States Postal Service and challenges facing our dedicated federal workforce to examining important Census Bureau issues, our subcommittee has a lot of work on its plate. and I look forward to working with you on all those issues in this new Congress. I appreciate the Chairman calling this hearing to monitor the Federal Government's progress in reducing travel and conference spending, strengthening internal controls, and enhancing cost transparency. It is important for the Congress and the American taxpayer to be assured that the government spends money only for what is absolutely necessary regarding travel and conferences. We all remember, as the Chairman has noted, the excessive improper spending by the General Services Administration on a 2010 Las Vegas conference and by the Veterans Affairs Department on 2 conferences held in Orlando, Florida. These conferences were regrettably wasteful spending, examples of wasteful spending which justified heightened scrutiny by Congress and the Administration. In particular, the committee held a hearing last April looking into the GSA conference, and the Administration issued a subsequent directive to all executive branch agencies mandating that 30% of travel and conference spending be reduced, and imposing conference cost restructuring and restrictions and public posting and reporting requirements. We all regret the government must, we all regret that the misspending that went forward there, and we agree that the government must be a good steward of American taxpayers' money, and that it is important to shine light on government travel and conference spending. As part of our oversight responsibilities, this hearing will help us examine agencies' progress in implementing the Administration's directive. It is critical for us to know how much the Federal Government as a whole is spending on travel and conferences. We need to ensure that only necessary conferences are held, that only those who need to attend participate, and that there are no improper expenses. In this regard, I look forward to Representative Holt's testimony about the impact on the scientific community. In addition, Mr. Chairman, I received 2 letters yesterday expressing views about Federal travel and conference policies, one from the American Association for the Advancement of Science and several other scientific organizations, and another from the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. I ask for unanimous consent that the letters be included in the hearing record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Lastly, I would like to note that we only have 2 legislative days before sequestration takes effect and 14 legislative days before a possible government shutdown takes effect. Accordingly, I would urge this committee to dedicate its oversight efforts to examining the opportunities to prevent that and also the potential impact of these budgetary events so that we can best address the corresponding needs of our agencies and Federal employees. Mr. Chairman, again, congratulations on your appointment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you throughout this congressional term. We have our work cut out for us, and I hope we can get all of it done. We have the distinct privilege of having a distinguished colleague here to testify before us, as is the tradition and protocol associated with this committee. We will allow Representative Holt, who represents the 12th Congressional District of New Jersey, to testify first, and I will introduce and swear in the rest of the panel. Representative Holt, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Farron Holt. Mr. Lynch, Mr. Clay, I thank you for the opportunity. As a professional scientist and now a member of Congress, I testify today with firsthand knowledge of how scientific innovation, especially what is developed from the sharing of ideas at conferences, contributes to every American's quality of life. As we work to ensure oversight on travel expenditures, we should also work to preserve the many benefits of appropriate travel. Many scientists, for example, receive Federal grants from the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Health, and others. And these scientists rely on Federal funding to travel to conferences in order to share thoughts, to collaborate, to learn from their peers in order to advance knowledge and to create innovation. Both H.R. 313 and the OMB guidance, I think regrettably, put forward prohibitions and impediments that hinder scientific collaboration and communication. I know firsthand how important scientific conferences and meetings are. The informal conversations as well as the formal presentations that go into a conference lead to real collaboration. These are not fancy junkets. What's so special about science? Why does it work? Well, it works because one of its fundamental tenets is communication. Now, to be sure, there are many ways to communicate, but scientific conferences are critically important. A recent essay by the presidents of the American Chemical Society and the American Physical Society discussed, for example, an anti-cancer drug that was the result of collaboration between a team of scientists at 3 laboratories that took place at conferences. And I think the obstacles this bill creates would hinder that kind of collaboration. The American Chemical Society, at its biennial meetings, attracts typically 13,000 chemists and chemical engineers, about 800 of them on federal contract. And under the new rules and the pending legislation, as I understand it, 50% roughly of those federal scientists would be cut off from participation with the chemistry community in these meetings. The Division of Plasma Physics of the American Physical Society, that I know well, meets each year with hundreds of engineers and scientists from around the country, many hundreds of them on DOE contracts. The fact remains that many insights are possible only because of close personal interactions among scientists who see each other regularly. Those who do not work at the same university or laboratory must rely on interacting at the conferences. Proximity matters in science as in other fields. Just to drive this point home, let me ask if you would propose that the legislative branch, you and I, remain in 435 separate locations, never to see each other, communicating by email and phoning in our votes. It could save hundreds of expensive trips each week to do that. Do you think, as I do, that the country would be worse off? I'm hopeful that this oversight hearing and administrative guidance would be modified to allow for scientific progress instead of obstructing the sharing of ideas and information. Weakening of collaboration is not a wise course. It is not the way to build our economy. It is not the way to create jobs and the innovation that leads to those jobs. We should be investing more in research and development generally at the federal level as well as in the private sector. But that also means investing in scientists and investing in scientists' ability to pursue the scientific procedure, which includes face-to-face communication as well as electronic and print communication. I would argue we should be spending more on conferences like those which promote. I realize this is heresy in the day before the sequestration takes place, but I would argue we should be spending more on conferences like those. We should be investing more in research and research scientists, in microbiology, in physics, in chemistry, in a myriad of other scientific areas. These are not instances of wasteful spending. Not every collaboration leads to successful science, but many do. And you don't need too many successful examples of cancer drugs, energy sources, transportation improvements, public health advances to understand that this is an important investment. I thank the committee.
Thank you very much, Representative Holt. You are welcome to stick around. I know our schedule is busy today. If you wish to take off and attend to other matters, you're welcome to do that as well. We appreciate your testimony and your input. At this, I also want to point out that as we got into this, I failed to mention earlier on that members will have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. So if you guys want to get something in, you've got...
and Mr. Chairman, I do have prepared testimony that I would like to have included in full.
Absolutely, without objection, so ordered. At this point, we'll introduce our other 2 witnesses. It's the Honorable Danny Warfel, is the Controller of the U.S. Office of Budget and Management. And Ms. Cynthia Metzler is the Chief Administrative Services Officer of the U.S. General Services Administration. Pursuant to our committee rules, our witnesses will be sworn before they testify. Would you please stand? If you'll raise your right hand, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that both witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion and questions, we ask that you limit your testimony to 5 minutes. I think you all have testified before Congress before. We've got these fancy little devices in front of you that count down the time, and much like a traffic signal, green means go, yellow means speed up, and red means stop. So we'll let you let you get going on that. We'll start now with Mr. Werfel.
Thank you, Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee for the invitation to discuss our work to reduce Federal travel and conference spending, as well as our efforts to increase public transparency on travel and conference activity. As you know, this administration has taken a number of aggressive steps to cut waste and modernize government over the past 4 years, working to create a government that is more efficient, effective, and accountable to the American people. A key area of focus in this effort has been working to reduce spending on travel and conferences by focusing on making smarter decisions, eliminating unnecessary trips and conferences, and implementing innovative solutions that reduce costs, save time, and achieve better results overall. More recently, in May of this past year, OMB released a memorandum entitled Promoting Efficient Spending to Support Agency Operations. This memorandum directed agencies to reduce travel spending in fiscal year 2013 by at least 30% from fiscal year 2010 spending levels, and to maintain these reduced spending levels through fiscal year 2016. The memorandum also directed agencies to institute a series of internal controls that require senior-level approval of certain conference planning-related decisions. Agencies now must seek senior management approval, all the way up to the Deputy Secretary or Secretary, for conference spending over a specific threshold. Finally, Federal agencies for the first time are required to begin public reporting of their annual spending on conferences in excess of $100,000, allowing the public full visibility into how Federal dollars are spent on conferences. Agencies published the first of these public reports on January 31, 2013. Our efforts are already delivering significant results. In fact, agencies expect to lower spending by more than $3 billion between fiscal year 2010 and fiscal year 2013, with nearly $2 billion achieved so far. The reductions have not only been the result of reducing overall travel, but by also ensuring that required travel is completed in a cost-effective manner. For example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has reduced travel costs by $125 million in fiscal year 2012 by traveling less and traveling smarter, and is on track to reduce total travel expenditures by an additional $90 million in fiscal year 2013 when compared to 2010 levels. And the Department of Interior has reduced travel spending by $30 million through higher utilization of low-cost alternatives to traditional travel, such as webinars, teleconferencing, and by conducting training in-house or in locations closer to employee home offices. These are just a few examples demonstrating agencies' work to reduce travel expenditures during this time of tight budgets. These innovative practices expand beyond travel. Agencies are also applying similar cost-effective practices in the planning and execution of conferences. This includes increasing the use of low-cost government-owned meeting and conference space. It also means thinking creatively about how to save money wherever possible, such as ending conferences a few hours earlier to avoid extra costs associated with an additional night of lodging. Agencies are also working diligently to establish new internal control procedures to ensure that this increased level of oversight and accountability continue as part of agency overall operations. As we continue to build on the progress made to date in reducing travel and conference costs, we are also aware of the important role travel and conferences can play in carrying out an agency's mission. It is important to remember that conferences, the definition of conferences, can involve much more than Federal employee traveling away from their official duty stations to receive training or network with distant colleagues. For example, an off-site training event where FBI agents learn how to prepare for a potential terrorist attack is considered a conference under Federal regulations. I think we can all agree that such an activity is neither wasteful or unnecessary. Therefore, while we must continue to be vigilant about reducing unnecessary travel on conference spending, we also must be vigilant in protecting activities that are necessary and vital to our shared priorities as a nation. While we believe it is important to highlight agencies' early efforts in reducing travel and conference spending, our work in this area is only just beginning. OMB will continue to work with agencies to find ways to cut costs, eliminate waste, and make our spending in all areas more efficient, transparent, and accountable. We also believe the cost-cutting activities agencies have enacted to date should become part of standard government operations going forward, and we are working diligently to ensure that these new standards remain in place for years to come. We look forward to continuing to work with Congress, the Inspector General community, other oversight institutions, and the American public to ensure agencies remain dedicated to rooting out waste and driving efficient spending in all government operations now and into the future. Thank you again for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warfel. We appreciate your testimony, and we'll get to questions in a moment. Next up, we have Ms. Cynthia Metzler. She is the Chief Administrative Service Officer for the GSA. Ms. Metzler, you're recognized for 5 minutes. You need to.
Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Cynthia Metzler, and I am the Chief Administrative Services Officer at the General Services Administration. In that capacity, I coordinate internal management and support services to promote efficiency within the agency, covering a wide variety of issues, including conferences and travel. I appreciate this opportunity to come before you today to discuss the reforms at GSA. I have submitted my full written testimony, and I'd like at this time to highlight a few of the key reforms. Under the leadership of our Acting Administrator, Dan Tanglerini, GSA has refocused its mission of delivering the best value in real estate acquisition and technology services to government and the American people. In April of 2012, the Acting Administrator issued new guidelines on travel and conferences. All spending for travel, including training, conference, and award ceremonies, was suspended. Oversight of conference and travel expenses was consolidated into my office, which was directed to review each and every planned conference to make sure that these events and any related travel is justified. As part of these reforms, travel and conferences can only be approved when all other alternatives, including video conferencing and webinars, have been considered. Additionally, travel must be for work related to GSA's essential mission, such as building inspections, contract negotiations, and meeting with customers. To ensure that all travel requests receive appropriate review, GSA has instituted policies that limit the use of blanket travel authorizations and require that travel is authorized in advance on a trip-by-trip basis. In addition, any international travel must be approved by the Deputy Administrator to make certain that the considerable expense is used only for legitimate purposes. With regard to conferences, they can no longer be held without submission of a detailed justification, including the mission-related purpose of the conference and whether any other alternatives were considered, a proposed budget, and a review and approval occurs from multiple divisions. At a minimum, this means that any conference, no matter what its proposed cost, is reviewed both by head of the division and by myself. In line with administration guidance, when the proposed cost of a conference exceeds $100,000, the Deputy Administrator must approve the conference, and if a conference is to cost more than $500,000, the Acting Administrator must approve it and document justification for why the conference must be held. To ensure that we scrutinize any internal meetings that require travel, the Deputy Administrator must approve these. Additionally, any attendance at a conference requires multiple levels of approval, including my office. Employees must justify their potential attendance and outline the expenses. To increase transparency and improve record keeping, GSA requires employees payment of all travel expenses. We have also mandated the use of the ETS travel system for airline, rail, and car rental, as well as Fed rooms for lodging. GSA now requires mandatory annual training regarding conference attendance for all employees. This training highlights the importance of considering cost-effective alternatives and ensures that each and every employee understands the difference between an appropriate and an inappropriate expense. We have also provided greater transparency into our conference expenses. We have posted all approved conferences held last year with a cost of over $100,000 on our website, and that includes the budget and a justification for why the conference was held. All told, these changes under Acting Administrator Tanglerini have dramatically reduced cost, improved oversight, and ensured that travel and conference expenses are fully justified and mission-related. In 2012, our travel costs were less than half of what GSA spent in 2011. We have saved $28 million through the end of fiscal year 2012 alone. Finally, as part of our agency's mission to serve our Federal partners and deliver savings, we are providing tools to allow agencies to better manage their travel and conference spending. We are working with OMB on changes to government-wide travel policies that will increase efficiency and effectiveness, reduce cost, and incorporate industry best practices. These efforts are in line with the Administration's aim to reduce costs and across a wide range of administrative expenses, including travel and conferences. We are firmly committed at GSA to improving the efficiency and effectiveness of the government, including reducing travel costs. Our work is not done, and we continue to refine our policies, work with OMB and other Federal agencies and members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and discuss our changes and welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Metzler. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. And I do think one of the important things that will come out of this hearing and the proposed regulations is a change in the culture on the part of government employees, again, to take to the mindset that this is the taxpayers' hard-earned money that we are spending, and you actually need to spend it more carefully than even you would spend your own money. Having gone to numerous conferences in my previous career as a lawyer, even working in the private sector, there were certain expenses I would not put down on the blue slip. I'd put the McDonald's lunch on there, but if I decided to treat myself to a steak dinner, I would eat that cost myself. Obviously, we can't ask the Federal workforce to buy their own meals, but when they are asking the taxpayers to pay for them, I think it's appropriate that they think, well, maybe I could do with a sandwich instead of a steak. And it's that sort of incentive. I think the GSA is taking the lead in that. Obviously, it's unfortunate that it had to come as a result of a very public scandal. But one of the impediments I see to taking advantage of that is actually educating the workforce and simplifying some of the tools like ETS and Fed rooms, and even though outside of the travel area, the GSA purchasing website. Very often difficult to use as for the end user compared to private sector equivalents. I know in my travel, I'm able to book online. I don't use ETS. I'm on United. I can get their government rates on their website, but I think they're one of the few airlines that offer that. I would encourage you to work with your vending partners to make the process much more simpler. But I am concerned the culture isn't catching on. There were recent reports that the Post Office spent just a ton of money. They had a $15 billion loss, cutting Saturday delivery, but they've got a conference that they set up in San Francisco that's going to cost $2.2 million. That seems like that's not in the spirit. Are we seeing the government actually following this? And I'll ask Mr. Werfel, are we actually seeing, have all the agencies complied, and are they reporting their expenses over $100,000, and are you getting that information?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there was, and thank you for the question, I think there was 1 or 2 agencies that missed our January 31st deadline, but for the most part, I believe all reports are now in. And I think the key here is that the reports do demonstrate what we believe to be happening post last year when GSA had the issue that we've been describing and OMB issued its memorandum, which is there has been significant attention to this matter and a lot of aggressive action to cut back on this type of spending.
Great. And do you have any numbers on how many conferences have gone over the $500,000 threshold?
Yes, I do have some of those summary statistics, and I believe it's roughly between 130 and 140 conferences that were over the $500,000 threshold. I can get you more precise numbers, but I want to be careful.
I would like to see those for the record. And are we seeing them actually posted on the website in a manner that the public can find?
Yes, that's how we got the information that I just shared with you.
All right, and it's my understanding the VA finally came in today with their report.
Yeah, I think that was the last agency, and I think we now have full compliance.
All right, Ms. Metzler, again, the GSA's job is to negotiate deals and save us money. Having grown up in and representing an area that the travel and tourism industry is important to, I understand that the revenue streams of hotels are derived not just from the overnight stay of the rooms, but in conference situations, often they'll give you the rooms free, but you end up paying a lot for the catering and can't bring in food. There are reports of very expensive breakfasts and lunches at hotels. Is there anything the GSA can do to leverage the government's buying power to bring some of those in line and bring the catering costs to where if you were going to do a conference at a hotel to within the allowable per diem rate for government employees while traveling?
Oh, thank you for the question. Since April of 2012, in terms of the conferences that GSA itself has hosted, we have been able to negotiate with the conference sites and the hotel to bring the food costs under the per diem rate. So we can begin working with OMB and other agencies to share our experience with that. So it is possible to do it.
And I am looking forward. I think it's an opportunity for the GSA to take leadership in making that available. I really do think it's consistent with the GSA's mission, and I look forward to having you back here next year and hearing what a huge success it is. But I see I'm running out of time, and we need to let the other members get their questions in. If we have time afterwards, I do have another round of questions if you all will indulge me. But at this point, I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for coming here today and helping us with our work. This is for both of you, I guess. If OMB tracks costs for travel and conferences separately, what are the government-wide totals for these categories? Is that how we're reporting this, or I'm just concerned about sometimes we begin to pay attention when we have a scandal like we did with GSA recently, but then things sort of get forgotten until the next scandal, and then it pops up on our radar screen again. What are the ongoing procedures and monitoring methods that we're using to keep track of this stuff?
Well, let me first start by saying that on the one hand, it's fortunate that our budget structure does enable us to isolate travel. And travel is a big category, and there's a lot of different there's a lot of diverse actions that take place under that category, but we do collect information. And one of the things that was in my testimony is when you look at the overall travel costs across government, they are steadily declining. They were $11.7 billion in 2010. We expect them to be closer to about $9.5 billion by 2013. Challenge that came up for us was with respect to the issue when we learned that there was this very significant financial risk associated with conference spending, that we do not and have not historically disaggregated conference spending within our budget accounts and the way we move forward. So we needed to take action because part of the challenge here is not only taking the specific steps to be smarter about meals and lodging, but also to understand the macro numbers that are going on across government and then agency specific. So what we've initiated now is this collection of information from agencies. We now have a baseline. I mentioned a number earlier to Chairman Farenthold in terms of the number of conferences over 500,000. Next year, we'll know the updated number and see where we're trending. We'll know the updated number of costs of conferences because we're collecting this information. The information we're collecting is imperfect because there might be a level of detail that you would like to know, and we have to balance the burden that's imposed on agencies in collecting all this information. What we've done is try to collect the right amount of information we think that enables us to see trends and identify risk points. But as I mentioned earlier, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Metzler, I think as a general matter, what we've seen occur since the situation with GSA and the Las Vegas conference is an enormous amount of attention that's generating very important and positive results in terms of improving our overall approach, not just to travel and conferences, but administrative expenses across the board, like information technology and other things.
Great. Ms. Metzler?
Since April of 2012, GSA now tracks its conference spending separately from its travel spending. And partly that's because in order to hold a conference or attend a conference, the requester must submit a detailed budget. And that budget includes the expenses of the conference, including booths, meals, travel. So we can now begin to disaggregate the travel costs associated with conferences, the travel we have that's mission-related travel that has nothing to do with conferences, and the cost of having a conference. We did not do that before April, and we're continuing to evolve it.
Very good. Do either of you have any examples where we might incentivize agency, departments, groups to spend less? Or is it simply, do we use the carrot and the stick, or do we just say, we want a 30% cut, and by God, we got to have it?
I think one of the things that I've learned through this process is that in response to a situation where we were, and many across government were angered and upset and wanted to, and continue to want to demonstrate to the taxpayer that we are way more often than not effective stewards of the taxpayer dollar, that this event has really incentivized a different set of behaviors across government. And from secretaries down to the GS9 or the GS7 employee that's involved in planning for these, there's an enormous amount of due diligence around this. Let me just give you one anecdote, because my job is not to get to do specific conferences, but every once in a while I get invited to a conference, or if it's about financial management, internal control. And so I was invited to participate in planning for a conference. I mean, it was the type of planning that went in where we were dedicated to doing it in a government facility. It had to be in Washington, D.C., because that's where most of the people were. We were going to do one day and try to pack in the most substantive agenda we could pack into one day. And on meals, since Chairman Farenthold asked about it, we held the facility near a food court, and we decided to do no catering, and everyone bought their own lunch at the food court. And that was, and that's the type of culture that we're transitioning into. Yeah, we had about 800 people or so.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Just checking. Sound like a lot of fun. No, but thank you. I appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lynch. We'll now recognize Mr. Walberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Let me just ask Mr. Werfel and Ms. Metzler a simple question. How frequently does conference spending on meals and on incidentals exceed the GSA set maximum allowable per diem reimbursement? How frequently does that happen?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, and I apologize for not. I can try to work on data that can get back to you. What I do know, and I don't know if this is going to be responsive to your question, is that what we are concerned about are situations in which if a conference participant is given a meal that creates no out-of-pocket cost for them, then they have to adjust down their per diem appropriately to make sure that they're not getting any extra funding or bonus as a result of this event. And that's a risk that we perceived as we were working through the conference activity. But in terms of your question, I don't have the specific data.
Ms. Metzler, do you have?
In our request to attend a conference or host a conference, one of the line items is the food item, and they have to justify that it's at a per diem rate. So that is part of the approval process. And GSA early on in April of 2012, under the acting administrator, limited the per diem costs for conferences, limited the cost for meals to the actual per diem.
But they're not pushing it?
We are pushing it, yes. We won't approve a conference or an activity that doesn't have it limited to the per diem rate. And that's part of our oversight. And as Mr. Wolfer said, when we're looking at a conference, we're looking at every alternative to make sure that people aren't getting inappropriate food, that if it's a local conference or not entitled to per diem, then there can't be any food provided.
But again, I guess what we're saying is we don't know the frequency of them pushing this GSA rule.
We know internally within GSA we're pushing it.
Okay. I guess my question was, the departments, they're coming to you with clean, clear requests for conferences then? I guess what I'm looking at, are they getting it? Are we getting it across the...
I think I understand your question and the root of your concern. Let me back up a second and say first that OMB as an institution does not approve conference by conference. We establish and work with GSA to establish government-wide regulations. Our regulations are getting stronger. They were already strong. A lot of things that happened in Las Vegas were violations of existing regulation, but nevertheless, it was still important to tighten those regulations even further.
Okay.
And it's really up to the agency to abide by those regulations. And my bottom line point is I do believe, based on everything and all my involvement in this issue, is that this issue is being taken as seriously as any in government right now.
Okay, good, good. Mr. Werfel, what was the total spent for administrative costs for all fiscal year 2012 conferences that cost in excess of $100,000? Administrative costs.
I think the total cost, and I think there's a slide up there, then that's, we're still kind of working through the numbers since, for example, VA's report has just come in, but I think that's in the right range. It's somewhere between $250 and $300 million in conference costs in 2012 for conferences that were above $100,000 in total cost.
Okay. Let me ask you, Mr. Werfel, it appears that military travel is not on pace to meet the 30% reduction goal. I mean, we're facing sequester issues now and great concern about the defense budget and capabilities. If this is the case, could you discuss what specific steps OMB is taking to ensure the Department of Defense meets this target by the end of this fiscal year?
So what we've done, and I think this echoes some of what Congressman Holt was saying, in taking the 30% cut, we wanted to make sure that we were protecting mission-critical activities where there was a real sense that a reduction or a steep reduction would compromise the agency mission. The goal in eliminating the 30% was making sure that we were eliminating excess or somewhat discretionary travel activities. I mean, all of it's important, but there's a difference between, for example, military travel or civilian travel to support particular military operations, sciences getting together to study molecular biology and study different diseases, and FBI agents getting together versus accountants getting together to train, procurement officials getting together to train. That's important. But what we perceive there is an ability to drive some greater efficiencies. In the area of military travel, we've essentially excluded that from our 30% reduction category because we believe that when the military travels, it's extremely important to give them some flexibility in terms of how they take those reductions due to just some of the really acute operational issues that will emerge. Let me just close by this point, which is really important. One of the challenges we have here, and it's one that we invite your feedback on, is that the definition of conferences is extraordinarily broad. And when this whole issue came up, we had to make a decision: do we try to narrow the definition of conference and then try to attack the problem on a narrow definition? Because If employees are co-locating to work, it's technically a conference. And that can even come up with respect to if FBI agents are co-locating to do an investigation, if scientists are co-locating in Africa to study a particular outbreak of a virus, that is technically a conference. And when you pile that into all the other conferences and attempt to take a 30% cut, it creates some mission complications. So we have decided for the time being to take this approach. We've not changed the definition of conferences. We've established a 30% cut, and then we've asked each agency to meet that 30% cut but protect certain activities, and we've had numerous discussions with agencies to make sure that they're not overprotecting or underprotecting. Military travel falls in the area of protection. If there's concerns about that, we should definitely have more discussions with you about maybe how we can resize that, but that's our approach right now.
Okay, I appreciate those details. Those are helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see with just 3 of us here present, we do have time, if you all indulge us, for a quick second round of questioning. And then I think we all need to be off to our other responsibilities. Where are we, Mr. Werfel, in reaching the 30% goal of reduction? Do you have a number? Are we at 10%, 20%? 30%? Are we close? How's it coming?
We're close. We're right in range, I would argue. I mentioned earlier that the total travel costs in 2010 were roughly $11.7 billion. We are on track for there to be a roughly, but a slightly more than $3 billion lower spend rate in 2013 versus 2010. I mentioned in my oral testimony that we are $2 billion of the way there. So we are zeroing in on a rough 30% goal in terms of seeing the overall travel spend reduction.
Since you monitor this, are you hearing anything kind of through the grapevine or around the coffee machine that these effects are really having an adverse effect, or are we getting the cost savings we're after?
I'm hearing mixed. I mean, I certainly, and this is something that I think that government agencies should be proud of. As you mentioned, it's unfortunate that we had this event occur that drove some of this. But the reality is today, the culture has changed dramatically in terms of travel and conference spending, and the public transparency we're providing, I think, feeds into more accountability and better results. But the biggest area that I've faced criticism and concern is coming from the scientific community, as Representative Holt mentioned. And I think it's very legitimate. These are very tough questions of public policy. What I've learned through this process and what I have a growing appreciation for is how critical to the advancement of science collaboration is. When there's a scientific advancement or a setback, the whole engine of science runs by co-locating and collaborating around it.
Some of the best inventions and breakthroughs have been as a result of accidents. I mean, you learn that in elementary school science. Mrs. Metzler, let me ask you a question. A lot of government employees who travel are issued a GSA travel card, much like the one I use for official travel expenses. I was at a speaking engagement in Austin, Texas last week, and bought my meals with this card. Under the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, the states can't tax us. But at every restaurant, they tried to tag me with sales tax. Had I used this card for a hotel, they would have tried to charge me hotel and motel tax. There's a complicated procedure and form that I have to fill out to save that money. And in Texas, sales tax, 8% plus, depending on where you are. Is there a way GSA can work with the credit card vendors or come up with a way where the taxpayers aren't paying taxes to the state, we don't have to?
Mr. Chairman, yes, GSA is looking at that. There are only 11 states that don't charge the travel card because they are, as you know, individually issued to the federal employee. With our fleet card, which is another part of the Smart Pay program, and that card and the purchase card, those cards are government cards, and there are not taxes charged to those, and there's factor recovery effort with the fleet card programs. But we are working with those other 11 states on the issue that you're raising.
Thank you very much. This is a huge savings with absolutely no cuts for anybody if we don't pay stuff we don't owe. To me, that seems like a no-brainer. Mr. Werfel, you mentioned, redefining what a conference is. I know the FAA struggles with every year they've got in Oshkosh a big air show of private airplanes, and they take the best of their controllers to Oshkosh to be the air traffic control for what becomes, for 1 week's time, the busiest airport in the world. And they're concerned that under conference definitions, sending those people there to do their job is a conference. So I understand your concern about that, which leads me to the next question I'll pose to both of y'all. What are we missing here, aside from defining conferences? Is there anything else that is too much or not enough in the proposals that we need to look at if we decide to pursue something on a legislative front?
Well, it's a good question. I think the definition of conference is one that we need to sort through, as I've mentioned. I think the keys here are help. We need, this public policy tension I mentioned before of we want to be very protective of taxpayer resources and make good decisions, but at the same time, an across-the-board cut of 30% or whatever it is needs to have a very well-thought-out exception clause. And we need a good structure in place to make sure that we're filtering through that exception clause things that should move forward as they were intended, and maybe the air show example is a good one of that, versus things that we might make a mistake on, and it would filter through. And so, that's a collaborative effort amongst professionals, both science, financial management, and maybe GAO could be helpful and involved in that as well. And I think the other key thing to look out for that we struggle with is how much data and how much to put on the web and to make clear. I mean, clearly we have a great start. We have total conference expenses, location, date, explanation of how the conference advances mission, number of individuals that are going that are paid by the agency, et cetera. We have a good footprint of information, but I can't answer all the questions that are being posed because I would need 20 or 30 more line items. But with each additional line item of data, you're asking agencies to collect that information, and that has an underlying administrative cost. So I think one of those areas to help us is figure out what is the Pareto optimal point in terms of data collection, because I think there's more to be looked at there to make sure we're at the right spot.
I'm out of time, but I will want to give Ms. Metzler an opportunity before we go back to Mr. Lynch.
I would just concur with what Mr. Werfel said, so I don't think I can add anything to that.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr. Lynch?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do notice that if you look at the text of the OMB memorandum and then you look at H.R. 313, in H.R. 313 it actually limits the number of people who can go to a conference to 50. And I have heard grumblings from some of the folks in our scientific community. Mr. Holt raised some of these concerns. I know the International AIDS Conference is attended by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, probably 1,000 scientists and others, experts, and also I think there's the Human Services Department and the National Institute of Health have in the past sent hundreds of scientists. Are we hurting the efficacy and the value of those conferences by severely limiting it to 50 people?
Yes, I think so, and potentially in two ways. One, if we don't enable the head of the agency or the leader of that particular program area to make a best judgment in terms of are we serving our mission effectively by getting more people there, and we have kind of a strict rule of construction. That's one thing. But I'll tell you where I come from and where my expertise is more around financial management and cost savings. And often we're sending more people in order to drive more efficiency, because if we've got to train these people, if we decentralize training and send 30 people and 30 people and 30 people to 3 different trips versus 90 people to 1 trip, that can have cost implications. And let me just give you one example to drive that home. Law enforcement, FLETC, we've developed these training centers around geographic locations to bring a bunch of people together to co-locate for that training. And if we set a limit of 50 people, you're devolving back into not co-locating for training, but a lot of disparate training, and that has cost issues.
That's great. Ms. Metzler, anything on that?
GSA does not send a lot of people to international conferences, so.
Okay. We're good. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lynch. I've enjoyed our first hearing. Look forward to continue to work with you and your staff and the rest of the committee. I'd like to thank our witnesses for taking the time from their very busy schedules to appear from us, and I charge you to go back and save the taxpayers some money. With that, we're adjourned.